Hello everyone and dear participants and panelists and who will be watching this video. Greetings. I am Somava Basu, President and founder of the Council for Global Cooperation, CGC, and I would like to warmly welcome you all to our today's session. Our today's session focuses on a new book, The Cambridge World History of Genocide. The Cambridge World History of Genocide is a 3-volume series contributed by several leading international scholars and experts, offers a comprehensive and world history of genocide across regions. The series is one of the CGC endorsed books of this year and is the first extensive documentation of genocides history ever published. Today's entire session would be moderated by me and Nathan Stolzfus, who is the Dorothy and Jonathan Rintels Professor of Holocaust Studies at Florida State University and an advisor to the CGC's Genocide, Holocaust and Disaster Studies Vertex. Today in this discussion, we have two featured speakers. We are joined by Ben Kiernan, the series general editor, and Norman Neymar, a volume co-editor. It is great to see you both. So today's opening remarks would be divided into 15 minutes between both the speakers, and that would be followed by a commentary session and a Q&A together. Before we start our today's session, I introduce the speakers. I just wanted to inform everyone in the audience list, they can raise their hands or type their questions in the chat box, and we would be definitely taking them up during the commentary and the discussion period, which will be followed after the opening remarks. So I would like to briefly introduce our today's speakers. We would be starting with Professor Ben Kiernan. Professor Ben Kiernan is the A. Whitney Griswold Professor Emeritus of History at Yale University and was the founding director of the Cambodian Genocide Program and the Genocide Studies Program at Yale. Within CGC, he is the co-chair of the Genocide, Holocaust and Disaster Studies Vertex. Professor Kiernan is a leading name in the field of genocide studies, and he is considered world's leading authorities on the studies of Cambodian genocide and Southeast Asia. He received several honors and awards for his contributions, and his research helped many governments, including that of US and Cambodia, to document the genocide abuses of Khmer Rouge. Among his numerous award-winning publications, I would like to name a few. How Pol Pot came to power, colonialism, nationalism, and communism in Cambodia, the Pol Pot regime, race, power, and genocide in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, and Blood and Soil, a world history of genocide and extermination from Sparta to Darfur. Along with Professor Kiernan, we are joined by Norman Neymar, another leading name in the genocide studies. Professor Neymar is the Robert and Florence MacDonald Chair in East European History at Stanford University and the co-chair of the Cold War Project Vertex within our CGC. As a scholar specializing in Eastern Europe, modern Eastern European history, genocide, and ethnic cleansing is the specialization of his expertise. His award-winning monographs include Fate of Europe, Genocide, a World History, and Stalin's Genocide. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross from Germany for his authoritative research on East Germany and Soviet atrocities in the region. As I was saying a little later, and today is indeed my happiest day that we have both Professors Kiernan and Neymar with us in the same platform and would be speaking for an interesting book. Both of them are my greatest inspirations and mentors, and of course, to many like me. So it is a real honor to host both of you for your new series published by Cambridge, and it's an excellent book. So without further delays, I would now like to pass on the floor to Professor Ben Kiernan for his opening remarks and to begin the event. So Professor Kiernan, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Samava, and I'd like to thank you and the CGC for hosting this event. The three-volume series of the Cambridge World History of Genocide is an attempt to cover the history of genocide and extermination, which I will explain a bit in a minute, from prehistoric times to ancient times, right up to the present. And it includes chapters by scholars from Europe, China, India, Australia, and Latin America. The first volume, I will discuss these three volumes in turn. The first volume is edited by myself and my two fellow co-editors, Tracy Lemos, who is a scholar, a biblical scholar, and also a scholar of ancient Israel. She's from Canada. And also by Tristan Taylor, who is from Australia, and he's a classical scholar of particularly ancient Rome. And in this period, and in this volume one, we cover the prehistoric and ancient and medieval and pre-modern worlds up to the 16th century. In volume one, I try to introduce the series in a chapter that I wrote on the causes, components, connections, and continuing challenges facing the scholars of genocide and practitioners of genocide prevention. And here we get to what the field that we're covering in genocide studies, not just the study of genocide, but another legal phenomenon, which is extermination. Genocide is covered in the Genocide Convention, which came into force in 1951. And it was a United Nations Convention that is defined as acts committed with the intent to destroy an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group as such. Extermination is not covered in that definition, but we feel that it's important enough to be included in the study of the phenomenon of genocide. Extermination is not limited to ethnic, national, racial, or religious groups, but it can also include political, social, or even economic groups. And it's also not required for proof of extermination to prove that there was the intent to destroy the group as such. So it could be cases of mass murder of civilian groups of any nature that are intentionally carried out, but not with the intent necessarily to destroy the group as such. And so we thought these were cases of crimes against humanity as they are defined in international law. Cases of extermination were important enough and close enough to the definition of genocide to be included in this coverage of our three-volume series. So after that introductory chapter, we began the volume one with not specific cases, but 5 thematic chapters, which examine the role of specific factors in genocide cases that occur through the ages. And the first case that we looked at in volume one is the thematic. The first theme that we looked at is whether the state needed to be involved in genocide. The Genocide Convention does not require that. It said that genocide can be committed by the state or private individuals or officials of the state. And so we looked at, there's a chapter looking at, by Helle van der Kilde, looking at genocide before the state and looking at the possibility of whether genocide could be conducted without the state in a period where the state in ancient or prehistory, ancient times or prehistory could occur without involvement of the state. There's also a chapter on religion and genocide, another theme that comes up a lot throughout the ages. Another one on gender and genocide, a very important theme. Fourth chapter, thematic chapter on genocide, starvation, and famine. And a final thematic chapter on climate, violence, and ethnic conflict. And following those initial thematic chapters, we then focus on specific cases, case studies. And there are 9 chapters in Volume 1 on the ancient world and 10 on the medieval world. And these chapters range not only across Europe, but across the globe to Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. For instance, ancient Israel and Mesopotamia, the ancient Greek, the Hellenistic and Roman worlds, the Chinese and Mongol empires, mass murders conducted during their expansion. There's a case looked at by George Dutton on Vietnamese expansion, and there's subjection of conquered peoples to genocide. India as well comes into it, a case in medieval India. And of course, the Spanish conquest of the Canary Islands and later of Latin America. And also there's a chapter on prehistoric Latin America, before the Spanish conquest, the evidence from mass graves of mass killings before the arrival of the Europeans in the Americas. There are also, it's important to point out, a couple of cases where investigations by our chapter authors showed that genocide didn't take place. We commissioned a chapter, for instance, on William the Conqueror's harrying of the north of England in the late 11th century. After his conquest of the southern part of England, it was alleged that he took his forces and conducted a genocide in the north, the harrying of the north, as it was called. But C.P. Lewis, who wrote that chapter, decided after looking at all the evidence that there wasn't a case that genocide had occurred. He described it more as a military and political expansion, more like a war ravaging of the north that led to, triggered a famine and a refugee crisis. But C.P. Lewis decided this wasn't a case of genocide. There's also a mixed verdict on the First Crusade in the 1090s, whereby looking at the evidence, Thomas Fudge and Maya Soiper Irish came up with different conclusions as to whether the First Crusade involved genocide, with Maya Irish concluding that the initial massacres at the outset of the First Crusade were genocidal, but Thomas Fudge differing on the conclusion of the First Crusade and the conquest of Jerusalem. He argued that it was not genocidal. And so the series has attempted to be comprehensive, and we've even attempted to look at cases that have been considered genocidal but weren't in the views of the chapter authors who we commissioned. This meant, of course, that we couldn't possibly be comprehensive. There are too many cases of genocide, as we found. Another case that we could have included was the Circassian genocide of the late 19th century under Russian imperialism. But we just couldn't fit everything in. And this became quite clear in Volume 2, where we found another case that turned out to be a non-genocide that has often been cited as a case of genocide, and that was Ivan the Terrible's sack of Novgorod, an infamous case in 1570. But Cornelius Soldat investigated that and came to the conclusion that there weren't any local contemporaneous sources. And so that concluded that this wasn't a case of genocide. But Volume 2 covers the period from 1535 to World War I, and it includes cases involving the indigenous world, the early modern world, and the imperial worlds, following on from Volume 1, which looks at the ancient, medieval, and pre-modern. And for Volume 2, my fellow editors were Ned Blackhawk, who is a Native American scholar and author of a very widely praised book on Native American history that was published recently. Benjamin Madley, a leading scholar of the American West, and Reby Taylor, a leading scholar of the history of Tasmania and colonial Australia. And volume 2 includes chapters by scholars from Africa, Australia, as I mentioned, Taiwan, Korea, Europe, including Ireland, and the USA, including 2 Native American scholars. And the general topics that are covered in volume 2 include settler colonialism, empire building, frontier genocides, and state domination, which leads up to the late 19th century and World War I. And the cases covered in volume 2 range from Australia, where there are 5 cases examined in individual chapters, to Southern Africa, 3 cases from there, to Korea under the Japanese, Ireland under British rule, Chinese westward expansion, the French Revolution and the French conquest of Algeria, the Dutch in Indonesia, and genocides of Native Americans. We look in 4 chapters at different cases there, and the Belgian Congo. So volume 2 ends then with 6 late 19th century cases, which we consider to be premonitions of 20th century genocides. And volume 3 goes from World War I to the present day up to about 2020, when the book went to press. And our editors, my fellow co-editors, were Norman Naimark, whom you'll hear from soon. He's an expert on Russia, the Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe, and also he's the general historian of genocide. Also a co-editor for Volume 3, Wendy Lauer, is an expert on the Nazi cases of genocide and on gender and genocide. She wrote or co-authored with Adam Jones, another expert on gender and genocide, that chapter in Volume 1. And finally, Scott Strauss, who is an expert on Africa as a whole, including Rwanda and the genocide there. And he's also a political scientist who studied the prevention of genocide and the problems involved there. And Volume 3 is divided into 3 parts, or 4 parts, I'm sorry. The first one is called Racism, Total War, Imperial Collapse and Revolution, and that covers the pre-war era up to the start of World War II. And part 2 covers World War II, not only in Europe, but also in Asia, including the Japanese in China. And part 3 covers the Cold War era. And then part 4 of Volume 3 covers globalization and genocide since the end of the Cold War. So there are chapters in Volume 3 on the Armenian genocide, the Aboriginal stolen generations in Australia, Italian colonial Libya, fascist Spain, Stalinist Russia and Ukraine, a chapter by Norman Naimark, who you'll hear from, Soviet Kazakhstan, persecution of Jews, Romani and Soviet POWs by the Nazis. Again, the last chapter I mentioned there is by Norman. The Nanjing massacre by the Japanese in China, genocide in Latin America, Mao's China, Indonesia, Biafra, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Guatemala, genocide of the Kurds in Bosnia, Rwanda, the Sudans, the Yazidi genocide, genocides committed by Al-Qaeda, the Rohingya case in Burma, now Myanmar, and the chapter by Scott Strauss on genocide prevention. My own 2 chapters in Volume 3 include one on prelude to genocide, as I call it. It looks at the rise of humanitarianism, as well as racism and anti-Semitism in the early 20th century. And I twin together, or regard as connected, the height of European expansion in the world as a whole, colonialism coming to its height, and the response to that in humanist activity and practice, as well as the legal response to that. For instance, the Hague Convention of 1907, which codified the laws of war and then also codified the concept of crimes against humanity. And also on the more civilian, non-legal side, the formation of the Congo Reform Association. We have a chapter on the Congo, Belgian Congo, and the Congo Reform Association was formed by people as well known as Mark Twain and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Edmund Morel and Roger Casement. Was formed in 1904, and in 1910, after decades of activity in the Congo, he then went off to the Amazon and compiled a major report on what he considered to be, although he didn't use the word, genocide in the Amazon. At the same time, you had the rise of anti-Semitism in political life in Europe in particular, but also elsewhere, as I show in that chapter 2. From 1912 in Spain, you had the formation of the anti-Masonic and anti-Semitic League, and that led into, with the rise of the Franco regime in the Spanish Civil War, a great deal of revived anti-Semitism in Spain, including relations between Franco's regime and Hitler and Himmler in Germany as they rose in the 1930s as well. And I cover that connection in some detail, including secret orders from Franco down to the local level to collect information on Jews and even handing over Jews to the Nazis. Meanwhile, in Ireland, with the death of Hitler in 1945, Eamon de Valera, the leader of the Irish Free State, signed the condolence book in the German embassy on the death of Hitler. This was one of the few states, Ireland was one of the few states in Europe, along with Franco's Spain, that did this. In Portugal, also a fascist regime at the time, flags were flown at half-mast on Hitler's death. Yet at the same time, there was a similar rise of anti-Semitism, not just in Europe, but in places like India, where I believe an Indian politician, Golwalkar, I think his name was, used the Nazi example as a model for persecuting Muslims under a Hindu regime. But in Thailand, the king of Thailand from 1914 to 1925, King Vajiraphat, wrote a long study of what he called the Jews of the Orient, in which he claimed that the Chinese minority in Thailand were a similar problem to the way Hitler regarded the Jews and other anti-Semites regarded the Jews in Europe. And it's a very sobering article to read today. This article by the King of Thailand is replete with not only anti-Semitic but anti-Chinese racism that came from the very top of the Siamese regime as it was at the time and was taken up by the Thai military dictatorship in World War II, which, as we know, became an ally of fascist Japan in World War II. Just to end that series of anti-Semitic developments, however, the newly emerging independent Republic of the Philippines in 1938-39, on its road to independence from the United States, gave shelter to 1,200 Jewish refugees who were fleeing Hitler's persecution. And that was under Manuel Quezon, who was to be the first president of the independent Philippines. My second chapter in the volume 3 covers the two, or I believe more genocides that took place, more than two in Cambodia under the Pol Pot regime. And I focus on how and the mechanisms by which these two genocides were conducted and the key organizations that persecuted the victims of genocide found to be cases of genocide by the UN-sponsored tribunal in 2019. These were genocides against the ethnic Vietnamese minority in Cambodia and the Muslim minority, the Cham people, a minority of Cambodia. The mechanisms and the power holders that pushed these genocides through were this party centre, as it was known, of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, of which Pol Pot was the leader, and Nguyen Chia, who was found guilty of genocide, was the deputy. That was the key organisation, but also the southwest zone of the country, led by the military commander Mok, was in other words, the party and the military were the two key organisations. How did they get this genocidal activity into action? How did they push these genocides through? There were three major methods. Control of the Standing Committee of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Kampuchea. There were various zones, like the Southwest, about 6 or so other zones, but unlike Mok, who was the head of the Southwest Zone and commander of the military and a member of the Standing Committee, not all the other zone chiefs were members of the Standing Committee, and excluding the other zone chiefs whom Pol Pot and Mok and Nguyen Chia didn't trust, and excluding them from the Standing Committee was a key mechanism. And the use of the Standing Committee to bypass other members of the Central Committee was a key mechanism. Secondly, Mok, like the warlord that he was, promoted members of his family to the army leadership, to the Central Party leadership. And Mok was notorious for that. And he had people placed in charge of the Navy, in charge of the central staff of the army, who were members of his own family, his daughter, his son-in-law, and so on. This was not done by other chiefs of other zones, only by Mok of the Southwest Zone. And that was another key mechanism. And finally, the deployment of lists, compiling lists of victims. This particularly came out in the tribunal, the UN-sponsored tribunal known as the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, or ECCC. The way the Khmer Rouge leaders under Pol Pot, Mok and others, Nguyen Chia, they compiled lists of their members, the targeted victims, and they got them all to write biographies and submit their names, and they collected the names. Now, when they took over the other zones, which they did, the Southwest Zone forces then expanded to the other zones of the country and took over those zones, purged the officials whom they didn't trust, and then if they didn't have lists at hand already, they started compiling them and killing the members of their victims who were named on those lists. This is a real finding, I think, of the tribunal that completed its work in the last couple of years, but found its genocide judgments, completed their genocide judgments in 2019. I'll leave it there and look forward to hearing Norman's remarks and those of the rest of you. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Kiernan, for an excellent overview of the book and also giving a texture of your chapters which you wrote in the volume. So we would definitely come during this, we will be definitely coming to that in the discussion hour. But now I would like to pass on the floor to Professor Norman Neiman. Professor Neiman, over to you.
Thank you very much. Sumava, thank you for the invitation to speak alongside my colleague, Ben Kiernan. Let me just say at the outset that participating in this project, this 3-volume project, was really a tremendous experience on my part. I really enjoyed it. And I want to say, and Ben's heard me, and I've said it directly to him, that without him, this project would not have existed and would not have come to completion. He was a quite extraordinary general editor. I mean, he was involved in every stage. If you notice, he edited some of the individual volumes, as well as was a general editor. As an academic leader, he was unbelievable. You know, we always talk about herding cats, but, you know, in the university as a chair or a dean or stuff like that, but there's nothing like herding cats when you're trying to get people to write, right? And to write in such a way that is acceptable. And he was just unbelievably patient and involved. And I also want to compliment him on his intellectual leadership, and it was really an extraordinary experience to witness, because, you know, dealing with something like genocide and definitional questions, and, you know, fights and problems and issues in the concept of genocide. Ben was very relaxed about it, and he just sort of let the authors go where they want. I mean, he set out certain guidelines, but let the authors go where they wanted to go with it. And that, I think, was an extraordinarily productive way to deal with the issue. And instead of, you know, kind of strictures of what genocide was and is and should be considered, you know, we were given a kind of, you know, go with it set of orders, and those orders then, I think, in the end, you know, proved to be very, very productive. So my compliments. There would not have been these three, I think, quite extraordinary volumes had it not been for Ben. So thank you, Ben. I appreciate it, and we all appreciate it. I mean, it wouldn't have been there without you. Absolutely not. I mean, general editor is too weak a term. I don't know what you could put there, but it wasn't autocrat, it wasn't dictator, but anyway. Okay, so Sumava asked me to talk about my two chapters in volume 3, and also about genocide prevention a little bit. You know, at the end I might say something about that, but Scott Strauss wrote a very nice chapter at the end of volume 3 about genocide prevention, and I urge you to take a look at that. Okay, so the first chapter I wrote was on genocide in Stalinist Russia and Ukraine. And it's worth mentioning Ukraine separately, given the facts of the Holodomor, which is the terrible famine in 1932-33, which people will argue about: is it genocide, is it not genocide? But again, those kinds of arguments strike me as not very productive. I mean, I think it is genocide. People think it isn't, but let's just assume for a second that it was. So I thought of this chapter in a kind of general context of what I would call communist genocides. Again, people might disagree with that notion, but in terms of Stalinist Russia and Mao's China and the Great Leap Forward and Cambodia, this is a certain kind of genocide which has to do with the mobilization of society, with trying to enforce utopian visions of the future in the present by force, and the willingness to use violence against opponents of these visions in extreme fashion, and infrequently in genocidal fashion. The numbers in the case of the Stalinist genocides of the 1930s are hard to know. There's a lot of argument about this, and scholars have been in NKVD archives, and the NKVD has cited certain kinds of figures. I mean, roughly, for example, 800,000 people executed in the 1930s. We don't really know that 800,000 people were executed. I'm guessing it's many more. Some people might say it's less. But the numbers are always tricky when dealing with these issues. And, I'm going to try in the next project, if I live so long, to try to figure this out a little bit better, because I'm very unhappy with the way people think about the numbers and the way death was used by the Stalinist regime to enforce its goals in the 1930s. So I go over this roughly in the same way, I did in a small book called Stalin's Genocides. It's somewhat updated in the version in volume 3 with newer literature and newer findings. But basically, it goes through dekulakization, which I consider agenocidal. And when I use genocidal, I think of like genocide. I'm not trying to decide whether it's genocide or not. I'm just saying it looks like, smells like, wags its tail like genocide. So dekulakization was the first set of incidents which have to do with shooting people, tens of thousands of people, and then exiling the rest to either special settlements or to the Gulag in one fashion or another. Stalin said the kulaks would be eliminated as a class, and literally he meant that. And the kulaks were driven out of the so-called kulaks. I mean, this is an invented category. I mean, it's hard to place in the Genocide Convention, right? These people were sent, out of the villages. Ukrainian, the famine of 32, 33, again, there are arguments about this. I've had these arguments with my distinguished colleague, Professor Suni at Michigan, who's sitting there watching me with beady eyes there, and I talk about the Ukrainian famine, but I consider it a genocidal event. There's a lot of evidence to show, I mean, not convincing evidence, but there's a lot of evidence to demonstrate that Stalin, in the context of a broader famine that was going on throughout the Soviet Union at the time, that Stalin had it in for the Ukrainians in particular. This becomes, by the way, very important, as you can well imagine, and you probably know, in the contemporary discussion about what's going on in Ukraine today, because is there, in other words, a long-term effort on the part of Russians to eliminate Ukrainians? I probably wouldn't go so far as that, but as some people do. But I do think that these are not unrelated events. There's also the national campaign, and people don't pay a lot of attention to this. But in point of fact, nationalities were attacked in the Soviet Union, particular nationalities, for example, Poles and Germans who lived mostly in the western part of the Soviet Union, on the borders of Ukraine and Poland. And these people were attacked and eliminated as nation. And I mean, there's a lot of evidence that what was going on there is, Stalin wanted to get the Poles who lived in the Soviet Union and to eliminate them. So is this genocide? Well, it may well be. And similarly with the Germans, this is even before the war broke out. There were deportations, there were killings, and these killings, by the way, took place throughout the 1930s. So it was, the first nationality campaigns really began the beginning of the 30s, but then accelerated, during the 37, 38 terror. Then there was the Great Terror itself, which I try to include in this, and large numbers of people were shot in the Great Terror. I mean, again, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people. There were lists. I mean, when Ben mentioned lists, I thought about all the lists, that have been made in all these various genocides. And there were lists of people that were drawn up. Stalin went over those lists. Sometimes in those lists that were, we've got these documents here in the Hoover Archives, a copy of these documents. He would change their sentences from 20 years in exile to the ultimate punishment, which is death. So in other words, he was signing death sentences and increasing the numbers of death sentences. I come to the conclusion that it's really hard to talk about the Great Terror as genocide because there were so many different targets. Everyone was a target. So you can't really say he's trying to eliminate this group or that group or the third group, which is, the essence of the Genocide Convention anyway. but it is an episode certainly of mass killing and of elimination. I mean, what do you do with the fact that he killed off army officers? You know, thousands of them. I mean, is that a group as such? Well, probably not. But it is a group, and he did attack them, and he did kill a vast majority of young and senior military officers. You know, part of this was this Operation 00447, which was an operation, I mean, not to be underestimated at all, against so-called asocial people. And this meant, you know, alcoholics, you know, the unemployed, the chronically unemployed, prostitutes. And these are all alleged, by the way. I mean, you have to be, I'm sure you are clear about this, that Stalin alleged that these people, and that the NKVD alleged that these people were asocial. And they were rounded up. I mean, they were not to be taken into this new communist society with them and with the leadership. And so they were rounded up and sent to camps, and frequently just simply eliminated. There's a lot of work to be done on this subject, it seems to me. And like I said, if I live so long, I will do some more. All right, let me turn quickly then to a chapter on Nazis and Slavs. Poles and Soviet prisoners of war is what I focused on. I mean, we know that Hitler believed that all the Slavs were Untermenschen. We know that he killed millions of them. But it was, we know too that Nazi plans, like the various iterations of Generalplan Ost, the general plan for the East, called for quite specifically the elimination of millions of Slavic peoples who were to be deported, you know, sometimes beyond the Urals, who were to be starved, and, you know, who were to be, you know, thrust into kind of, those who remained would be thrust into the role of helots. And they even, you know, the Nazis even gave numbers. And I cite those numbers in the article about how many millions, you know, would go in what direction of that. Now, this didn't happen, right? I mean, in the end, Slavic peoples were not eliminated. And during the war, I mean, the war essentially went bad for Hitler, and except in the first months that we'll talk about in a minute. But he, you know, he managed, and when I'm, you know, using Hitler, I'm meaning the Nazi hierarchy and the leadership and that sort of thing. I'm not making this all into Hitler. But there were very uneven treatments of the Slavs. You know, some Slavs were treated just fine. Croats, for example, you know, were allies of Hitler. Meanwhile, the Poles were battered terribly by Hitler. So I deal mostly then the two cases that I talk about. So what I'm trying to say is this is a very uneven project, the anti-Slavic project, and you can't, you know, you can't make too many generalizations about it. So I look at very quickly the Poles. I see I'm going over my time. The Poles, you know, where there were quite specific, again, lists drawn up of 60, 70,000 Poles who were to be eliminated after the campaign against Poland. You know, in that famous statement that Hitler supposedly said, and who remembers the Armenians now, or who speaks of the Armenians now. And this is about the Poles. This is not about Jews, and about battering the Poles and making sure that the Poles are destroyed in the course of the invasion. And that was quite clearly Hitler's intention. He had to back off. There are arguments within the Nazi hierarchy about how to deal, you know, with the Poles. You know, some want to put them to work, some want to kill them. I mean, so there's a kind of mixed bag on how you deal with the Poles. In the end, you know, close to, I mean, originally the figure was 3 million. It's probably closer now. Scholars recently, it says now 2.4 million Polish Christians were killed in the war. This, and plus, you know, 3 million Polish, plus, I mean, 3 million Polish Jews, or more probably than 3 million Polish Jews were killed during the war. So I come to the conclusion, by the way, that this should be considered genocide. There are all kinds of side elements to this, including the transfer of children, large numbers, thousands of children who were transferred and Germanized and taken away from their families, and depression of Polish birth rates and that sort of thing, purposely by the Nazis, give reason to think that the Poles, are right to think about this as genocide. Okay, quickly, the Soviet POWs. I mean, I had the good fortune to work in the papers right before, the war started, in the papers of the Extraordinary Commission of the Soviet Commission on the Crimes Against Soviet Citizens in the Soviet Union by the Nazis. It's a big long title that I goofed up. So lots of wonderful documents, fantastic documents. The Soviets went into every town, every camp that was liberated, and interviewed people, so I could work on those documents. And what I found on the Soviet POWs was terrifying and awful, and really an example of Nazi brutality and eliminatory kinds of actions. So the bottom line is, in the first months of the war, especially in the fall of 1941, hundreds of thousands of Soviet POWs were essentially killed. I mean, they were put in big pens. Many of you know this story. And were not fed, and caught terrible diseases. Typhus was the worst killer, and basically let to die, which I consider to be killed. There were, I think, altogether, the 5.7 million Red Army soldiers fell into Nazi hands, and 3.3 million died of that number. That's really extraordinary. By the late spring of 1942, the Nazis had not won the war, and they decided they needed these bodies to go work in the factories, because they needed the Germans who were in the factories to go fight at the front. So they cleaned them up, and they gave them enough food to live, and then they transferred about 1 million plus of them, to the Reich to work in the factories. So the killing program then stopped. Is this genocide? I don't think so, for a lot of different reasons, but it's a real case of elimination. You know what I think I'm going to do, Samava, is this is a very distinguished group you have out here who know a lot about strategies of genocide prevention. So I think what I'm going to do is stop and not talk about the Scott Strauss, article about genocide prevention, and just leave it at that. Is that okay, or do you want me to continue?
It's fine if you want to add something, or it's like you can end as anything.
Well, all right, let me just list a few things fast that everybody knows. I mean, this is, again, a very distinguished group, and I'm not going to spend too much time with it, but we know that that notions of genocide prevention have changed over time, right? And what you do about genocide prevention. I mean, we know in the Armenian genocide, for example, the American officials said, the Ottoman Empire is sovereign, and there's nothing we can do. We can't intervene, period. And these notions generally change over time about intervention, and to the point where, as again, we all know, especially in the 1990s, intervention then on behalf of victims of genocide, became more common. And also became justified through the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, which came out of Bosnia, Rwanda, and Kosovo. We can go into details if you would like. That doctrine of the responsibility to protect, I think, more or less represents, and Scott also has it, more or less representing the various levels of intervention that people can engage in, starting from diplomatic entreaties and going to sanctions and ending in actual physical intervention. And this was approved by the UN in 2005. So the responsibility to protect is out there, and it's a doctrine about intervening. Then there are the courts, and we need to talk about the courts, but I'm not going to go into that in detail either. But the courts are more and more interventionist, more and more active, the formation of the ICC through the Treaty of Rome, and at the beginning of the Treaty of Rome, and then becoming active at the beginning of this century, is a real innovation. I mean, people will argue about the courts. They should argue about the courts. Some say they're more effective, some say they're less effective. But in my view, they do help, this notion that genocide prevention is there. And finally, let me just say, there are all kinds of new ways of thinking about genocide prevention. I have a postdoc here at Stanford who's working on cyber intervention, interrupting various sorts of using cyber as a way to get involved in genocidal situations like in Ukraine today, both to disrupt certain kinds of activities, to stop certain kinds of propaganda and that kind of thing. And then genocide scholars themselves have identified various stages of genocide, and it's important to think about those stages. The preliminary stages, you will hope, you get dehumanization and propaganda and that sort of thing. You hope that now there'll be a kind of alert out. And the final thing I would say is these volumes themselves. I mean, most of us are scholars. We try to do our homework and write up, our histories the best that we can. We're all in this for genocide prevention. I mean, we're all in it to try to stop this awful phenomenon. And the reason, I think Ben really started with his wonderful volume on the world history of genocide, the reason to show that this is a world historical phenomenon is to get people to understand these are not unique things. And that, for example, the Holocaust, which is horrible and awful as it was, is not the only genocide. There are lots of them, and they're everywhere, and we'll never know them all. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Naimak, for giving us an overview of your chapters and also pointing us on the genocide prevention. So we would now like to go to the other phase of this event. That is we would like to go to the panelists in the panel today. That is Professor Robert Melson, Professor Hannibal Travis, and Benjamin Valentino. But before that, I just wanted to remind the audiences that you can use the raise hand function or the chat box to put your questions, and we would definitely take them up in the middle. So now I would like to go to our first commentator, Professor Robert Melson. Professor Robert Melson is the Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Purdue University and Clark University. He was the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars from 2003 to 2005. His major area of teaching and research has been ethnic conflict and genocidal massacres in Europe and Africa. I would like to name a few books authored by him, and that is False Papers, the story of his and his family's survival during the Holocaust, which was also a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. Revolution and Genocide, on the origins of the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust, and Nigeria, Modernization and the Politics of Communalism, edited by Howard Wolf. It is a great pleasure to have you with us today, Professor Melson. The stage is yours. We can't hear you. I think you are muted, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you for the invitation to comment on this extraordinary effort headed by Ben Kiernan and Professor I'm honored to comment on this extraordinary enterprise. In the instructions, we were asked to pose a question to the speakers, and what I thought about when I received the the volumes online, and of course I couldn't in a week read all the papers. But one thing that struck me was, in terms of the two cases that I looked at carefully, was the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust, that in both of these cases, the victims were not a priori. They had to be invented. They had to be created. Take, for example, in the Armenian genocide, the Armenians had been part of the Ottoman Empire for 500 years before the Young Turks came to power in 1908. By 1915, the Young Turks presided over a Turkey that had been cut down by the Balkan Wars. In that context, they were the empire had lost most of its Christian minorities, and the Young Turks became integral nationalists. Let me interrupt for a second. There's something wrong with my connection here, and I hope you can hear me.
Can you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, because I can perhaps you can. The Young Turks became integral nationalists, and they looked at the Armenians in not as members, not as zimmis, as minorities of the Ottoman Empire, who had traditionally certain rights and were for hundreds of years, except for periods like 1894-96, had been part of the system, began to see them or saw them as intruders, as foreigners, as a foreign nationality that had to be eliminated in order to save Turkey. They had to reconstruct who the Armenians were. Similarly with the Jews, by 1871, the Jews had become part of the Imperial Germany. They were an emancipated society. They were an emancipated part of imperial society, and did rather well until the First World War, and so on. And what happened under the Nazis, of course, was that emancipation had to be destroyed, and the Jews had to be reinvented as a racial threat to Germany and indeed to the world. That we know that about these two cases, about the reconstruction of the identity of these minorities before they were killed. My question is this: when I look at the ancient world, or the colonial world, the imperial world, the settler colonialism, and so on, is it the case that the prospective victims were also redefined, or were they from the beginning of their victimization, even before their victimization, simply viewed as savages, heathen savages, or barbarians, and therefore there was no reconstruction needed? When you think of the Congo, you think of, for example, Joseph Conrad wrote The Heart of Darkness, and his Kurds his protagonist refers to the natives of the Congo as brutes, non-human beings that could be killed or enslaved at will, as indeed they were. So that's my question. If I'm not familiar with all of the cases in the encyclopedia, but once I received the encyclopedia, that's certainly one of the things I would look for. In the other cases that we're talking about, in the pre-modern period, were victimized groups assumed to be part of a world that the imperialists or the Romans could do away with at will? Or are there any instances where a victimized group was part and parcel of ancient Rome, or part and parcel of the society that later turned against it, as were the Armenians and the Jews? Really, that's really all I have to say. I should also comment that I appreciated Professor Neymark's remarks, as I did Professor Kiernan's. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Melson. Yeah, I think Professor Kiernan would like to reply. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Robert, for those comments. I think you've struck on a very important difference between some of the cases through the ages. And one thing I've been thinking about is the difference between cases where land was the issue and cases where ideology was the issue. And that seems to me to fit the distinction that you're referring to. And I think the other what's the word, transition that you talked about is one where people who became victims later were initially accepted and were not seen as targets or victims. I can say that, you know, the initial attitude of the British settlers in Australia was, according to their orders from the British government, was to treat the natives with respect and treat them with amity and kindness. And I think that was possibly the case for the English settlers in North America as well. But once it became clear that the question was disputes over land, and that the indigenous peoples, both in Australia and in North America, were not just going to walk away and give up their land, perhaps that became the point of transition, that there was a real struggle over land, and if it came to that, then the invading or colonizing settlers, when in the case of settler colonialism, were prepared to commit genocide in order to seize the land of the indigenous people. In the case of the Armenians and the Jews in later times, I think it was much more a question of ideology than of land. These were not cases of settler colonialism, but were cases of racist ideology being whipped up with either, in the case of the Young Turk regime, fear of losing their land, their empire, and in the case of the Nazi regime, ambition to expand their empire. But it was not a case that the Jews or the Armenians were occupying land that was targeted for settlement, as in the case of indigenous peoples in earlier cases. Norman might have some remarks to make as well, but I think your your points are well made, Robert. Thanks.
Thank you.
You're muted.
Saying that was an excellent and important question. And the only thing I would add, I mean, there's a lot to add, but you know, we've all pretty much come also to the understanding that genocide itself is a kind of process, and it's hard, you know, to know when it begins. It's also hard to know sometimes when it ends. And that process is what you're describing a little bit in both the cases, I think, of the Holocaust and of the Armenian genocide, where, you know, the kind of dehumanization, the escalation of violence, you know, takes place within certain kinds of contexts. In both of these cases, obviously, within the context of war. And you know, you know, there's a kind of I mean, you can talk about beginnings, right, of when this happens, but then a kind of escalation of the process. So there is the intellectual origins, but there's also a dynamic of genocide that goes on within genocide, which you know yourself, and I think have written about, even that within the genocides, they become in some fashion genocide. I mean, they don't start necessarily as genocide. I mean, Armenians in theory started as a deportation. You know, in the theory, what was happening to the Jews originally was to get them out of Europe, you know, to let them go to Madagascar or someplace like that. So you have an escalatory situation, a process, and the war as the context, with these preconditions that you were mentioning in the case of the Armenian genocide, the Ottoman Turks losing land in the Balkans, and other sorts of things like that. So, you know, it's part of what we try to figure out, I think, when we study genocide, is how this process works, how it gets started, and then what happens during it, you know, to escalate to the point where whole nations are attacked and eliminated.
Thank you, professors. And thank you, Professor Melson, for the excellent question. So now we would like to go to Professor Hannibal Travis. Professor Travis is the professor of law at Florida International University. As a legal scholar, he teaches and conducts research in the fields of comparative law and human rights. And he is also a celebrated scholar of genocide studies and cultural survival. He is the editor of the Assyrian Genocide, Cultural and Political Legacies, and the author of Genocide, Ethno-Nationalism, and the United Nations, Exploring the Causes of Mass Killing since 1945, and Genocide in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire, Iraq, and Sudan. He is a member of several leading legal consultancies and forums and organizations studying genocide and human rights. And within CGC, he is an advisor to our Genocide, Holocaust, and Disaster Studies Verdicts. Good to have you again, Professor Travis. Over to you.
Thanks, Sumava, and thanks to Professor Kiernan, Professor Mark for having me today to discuss their very comprehensive and scholarly text. I was particularly impressed comparing it to other handbooks like the Oxford Handbook. The coverage of Asia and North and South America, I would say, is distinctive in its completeness and its depth. I would like to focus my remarks on, how in the future can we add to a text like this, and particularly from my point of view as somebody who looks at the Middle East and North Central Africa. I won't say that much about the Asian and other coverages, other than to say congratulations for putting it all together. It must have been a monumental task. So to start with some observations on what genocide is and why people sometimes don't discuss certain cases in the Middle East or North Central Africa as genocides, there's this idea of genocide as a total mass extermination, which I have sort of contended with in my literature. I've pointed in my articles, I should say, I've pointed to different tribunal decisions distinguishing different local areas as targets of genocide. Srebrenica area, municipalities of Bosnia, Sarajevo, and in the diplomatic level, places like Kosovo, and so on. So, viewed from that point of view, I think we could broaden some of our cases, particularly when we study the 21st century. The book has a very good chapter on Sudan and the Rohingya and Rakhine State, Myanmar. It touches on a lot of aspects of the Kurdish situation in Iraq, Turkey, and Syria, which don't often get analyzed properly. But, there are some absences, I would say, that future scholars might look to. Compared to some parts of the world, the former Persian Empire is sort of not as fully analyzed. It's barely mentioned in the Mongol and Timurid chapter. It's referred to through its Khorasan region, which was a particular target of 13th and 14th century attacks, which were, I would say, much larger than Zhongqing, which I think is a focus of the Mongol chapter, and probably also much more intentional destruction, places like Herat, Samarkand, and whatnot, than Ireland or Ukraine. I would argue there were fewer, peace treaties than with the Pequot or the Huron in North America. Yet the Mongol attacks on Western Asia is almost one of the only genocides minimized in the entire text, saying that recent scholarship has undermined initial claims that there were millions of deaths in Mongol conquests. And, coming from, my heritage in the Church of the East, the people in the Church of the East often say that there were tens of millions. Was there a glitch or something? No.
No.
There were tens of millions of members of the Church of the East, the Persian Church, but it's been reduced, from around 21 million to only 3.5 million after these Mongol conquests. And Mesopotamia is one of the few regions that had a lower population in the 20th century than in ancient times. And some of these other cases that I would mention of populations that were put to the sword or harmed in a genocidal way in terms of mental harm or conditions of life or reproductive and acculturation harms. The sack of Constantinople, the destruction of the Empire of Trebizond, the Pontus region, the slave trade, one of the last slave trades to be abolished, the Russian and Circassian slave trade in Ottoman Empire and Crimean Khanates, the destruction of Chios and Hakkari in the 19th century Ottoman Empire. We could do more to incorporate into such research in the future. The Greeks of contemporary Turkey do not receive equal attention to the Armenians in the two chapters about the Ottoman Empire. There's a recent book that compiles a series of analyses on that I could refer you to. And, particularly when I compare some of these Western Asian cases to the cases that are emphasized where the population has actually increased. So, for example, Ukraine in 17 or 1800 had 4 million people, but by the late Soviet Union, it had 50 million people. So if our criterion is, well, we're only looking at total genocides, how do we include Ukraine and not some of these Western Asian or some of these Central African cases I'll talk about in a minute? Similarly, in the USSR, the number of Muslims reached 44 million by 1980, including 6.5 million Kazakhs, who are the focus of one chapter. And in terms of the 21st century, there is sort of a hesitancy to talk about places like Iraq and Pakistan, where, numerous civilian casualties and sort of structural violence leading to malnutrition and mass flight have occurred. Conditions of life in Iraq have led to several million excess deaths, I think a lot of people would say. 80 to 90% of the Christians have left Iraq. There's only 200,000 left versus 2 million Muslims in Myanmar today. The Kurds are a particular focus in both Iraq and Syria, but their numbers have increased from something like 1.5 million at the end of the mandates to like 13 million today. Kurds. And in Syria, there's some mention of Syria along with Yemen in one of the final chapters by Mark Levine, but it's estimated that 1.3 million excess deaths may occur in Yemen by 2030. I think it deserves a chapter in future studies. And then finally, Nigeria and Ethiopia, 500,000 excess deaths are predicted in Ethiopia with sort of the blockade and lack of press coverage of the Tigray region and the mass assaults on civilians there. More people have been displaced in Ethiopia than in Rakhine State. And in Nigeria, 4,000 Christians are being killed every year. Thousands of churches have been attacked. The bishops of the country are comparing it to Rwanda, but it's not covered in a lot of these studies. I think we would do well in the future to look at places like Nigeria, as well as Ethiopia, Yemen, and other less studied cases in terms of mass violence and mass refugee flight and mass abduction. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Hannibal. That's all very useful and informative. Much of it I wasn't aware of, and I'm grateful to have that information. And I'd like to hear more. If you could possibly send me a few of the references that you mentioned, I'd be very grateful.
Okay, so I'm sorry, there was some net issue from my end, and probably I got turned off. Anything Professor Neymar would like to add?
I have nothing to add.
Okay, sure. So thank you so much, Professor Travis, for your comments. And so now we would like to move on to Professor Benjamin Valentino. Professor Benjamin Valentino is the Professor of Government and the Chair of the Department of Government at Dartmouth College. As a political scientist, his research interests include the causes and consequences of violent conflict and American foreign and security studies. At Dartmouth, he teaches courses on international relations, international security, and American foreign policy. He is the author of Final Solutions, Mass Killing and Genocide in the 20th Century, adapted from his PhD thesis, which received the Edgar S. Furness Book Award for making an exceptional contribution to the study of national and international security studies. His work has appeared in several outlets, namely the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Journal of Politics. He is currently working on several important research projects focusing on public opinion on the use of force and developing early warning models of large-scale violence against civilians. And we really hope to read that soon. It's a great pleasure to have you, Professor Valentino. Over to you.
Hey, well, thank you. Thank you for having me here, giving me the opportunity to spend some time with this extraordinary, I think, set of volumes. They really are remarkable. They're going to be extremely valuable to me, to my students, to other people interested in studying these subjects. I'll just say a few things about how amazing they are, and then I'll make some broader comments about the thoughts that they inspired in me. So I really do think this is the most comprehensive set of scholarship we have on the subject of genocide, well beyond, I think, anything I've seen before. Quite extraordinary in its reach, with cases dating back to at least 500 BCE, wide geographic scope, notwithstanding some of the points that Professor Travis made. There are some areas that are better covered than others, but still cases from every populated continent on Earth. And what's more, the editors have really assembled many of the top scholars working on these subjects, and the historians working on these different kinds of events. So again, I really do think this will stand as the most authoritative source we have on the history of genocide as a general class of events, right? There will be, obviously, for any individual event, there's a large literature, and no one could hope to do enough justice to it in a collection like this to supplant those. But as the kind of one-stop shop for the history of genocide, I think this is really an impressive achievement. And so Ben and the other editors and all the contributors, I think, really deserve congratulations for putting something like this together. I know I'm going to use it a lot, and I'm sure others will too. So I'm really impressed and glad to have had a chance to look through it. That said, of course, there's no way for me to comment on all, and I added them up, 2,188 pages of these 3 volumes. I calculated in the 10 minutes allotted to me, that would be something like 3.5 seconds per page if I tried to comment on all of it, and I will not do that. And I'll admit, in the short time I had with this, I wasn't able to read every single page of all 3 volumes, although I did look through every chapter, and I'm looking forward to giving them all the care with reading that they deserve in the future, because each one I think really was interesting and valuable. Instead, I really just want to focus on one main theme that occurred to me as I went through the volumes, although that theme can be kind of broken down into a couple of different parts. And that theme is, there was an opportunity here as we looked across the sweep of history and geography of mass violence going so far back in time to think a little bit about the intellectual history of genocide, as opposed to the history of the events, the history of how we've thought about these events, how humans have understood this kind of violence over the centuries or millennia, our understanding of genocide and how it came to be considered this crime of crimes that we think of it today. The intro to the first volume talks about this a little bit. There's maybe 2 or 3 pages devoted to this question, but I wanted much more after reading this. How is it that this kind of violence, which I think, again, reading through the chapters, you could see, at least at some points and in some places in history, seems to have been accepted as a part of certain kinds of violence, war, other kinds of relations, at least under certain circumstances. How has it come to hold this place in our consciousness today of being something completely apart from anything we could imagine as being acceptable? So in that first chapter, the intro to the first chapter, there's a kind of recognition that this has happened in other kinds of violence. Slavery, of course, at one point in human history, or for the vast majority of human history, I think, from all we know, broadly accepted as a form of social relations. Again, under certain circumstances, it wasn't permitted in every way or in every kind of relationship. But eventually, that changed. And by the late 19th century, had become, I think, considered abhorrent in almost every part of the world, although it's still not completely extirpated even today. Siege warfare, if you look back at the earlier cases in the volumes, many of them involve siege warfare or the sacking of conquered cities. These were considered the normal part of violence and war. And even after reading through all 3 volumes, I'm not quite sure how it is that that sort of violence, which was once accepted, again, in some cases, even something to brag about openly by the perpetrators of that form of violence, something that you could come back to your people and victoriously claim how happy they should be at the extermination that you wrought in their name abroad. how that came to be considered among the most terrible things that humans can do to one another today. That story, I think, is not as clear as it once was, as it might be, and as I think anyone looking at this long list of cases over such a big period of history would naturally begin to wonder. And again, if this is not just a story of something that's happened in the West, I think one thing I like a lot about the book is that neither the victims nor the perpetrators are purely Western focused. So we have non-Western perpetrators, including pre-modern indigenous societies perpetrating this violence. It's clear this kind of violence is not purely a Western concoction, as some people have suggested, although we may have perfected it in the West. And we know that today that growing norm against genocide is not purely a Western norm, so it's penetrated non-Western societies as well. So across societies, it was rejected, and now it was accepted at one point, and now today it's accepted. Within that, there's a bunch of little questions, or maybe big questions, involving which parts of this kind of violence came to be seen as abhorrent and impermissible, and how the norms in our understanding of them evolved. So there's questions about the evolution in our conception of who deserves protection from violence. Who counts, in other words, as innocent? Who should we hold outside of the groups who can be legitimate victims of violence? And does that depend on their actions, the things that they do, whether they're in some way directly or indirectly involved in violence, for example, supporting a war effort? Or does it just depend on their identity? In other words, whether they're Christians or non-Christians? Is that what really determines whether someone is innocent? And again, going back into history, you can see how that has changed over time. If it is about actions, which actions count, right? If I work in a munitions factory and I'm targeted by the adversary's weapons, am I a victim in the same sense as I am if I live in a village where a insurgent group was operating? Or if I simply am a citizen of a country that's involved in war, I live in a city that's bombed by the adversary. In general, I think there's a question which we who study genocide don't ask ourselves enough, but that's, what is it about identity-based, or as the editors call it in this group of volumes, group selective violence, that seems to make it particularly abhorrent to us? Why do we want to call out that category of violence as somehow different or special? And is that something we have always done? Again, going back in history, would people 2,000 years ago have thought there was something special and different about group selective violence from all the other kinds of mass violence you might imagine? Why should it matter so much if people are murdered because there is some vision of eliminating their group, say an indigenous group, as such, as opposed to whether they happen to be living on a piece of land that the perpetrators wanted, and they didn't care what groups they belonged to. Maybe they eliminated members of dozens of groups occupying the same piece of land because they simply wanted the land. They might have even been eliminated by members of their own group, right? With no sense that their people being killed are any kind of separate identity-based group that you can imagine. Why should we care about that distinction? Is it something to do with the intuition that it's wrong to kill people for something they can't change, like the color of their skin, as opposed to something they can change? But that, of course, raises the question about what can be changed and what cannot be changed. Can my political ideology be changed? Can my economic class be changed? Can my religion be changed? In some of the cases we've looked at, there's at least a possibility of escaping victimhood by converting one's religion or nationality, for that matter, accepting a new nation as one's rightful government. So it raises that question. Or is it something else? Are we putting a spotlight on identity because we think that in some way there's something precious about the diversity of human identities that exist? And in some way, this concern is something akin to an Endangered Species Act for human culture, right? And you could see some elements of that in the Genocide Convention and in Lemkin's thinking about genocide, and in discussions about cultural genocide as well, that what we're really concerned about is human diversity and difference, and we want to preserve languages, cultures, ways of thinking. And that's really where the moral weight of genocide lies. And again, I suspect that views about that have changed dramatically over the 2,000 years that are documented in these books. Lastly, I'll say there's another category that reflects what I think are changing views about appropriate, allowable, and unallowable abhorrent violence. And that has to do with our definition of what it means to be intentional. There's lots of debate among genocide scholars about how to interpret intent. Is it merely that the deaths that result from your action were foreseeable, that you should have known that some large number of people would die? If so, when do we count the deaths that occur from famine? There's a great chapter in the book on this, during war, or from sieges, or from diseases that were spread in the contact between European and indigenous populations. How should we think about those sorts of deaths? There's actually a fair bit in the book about those questions. How should we think about the deaths that occur during processes of forced relocation, where it looks like death was not the primary intent of the perpetrators, but it was certainly the foreseeable result of the actions that they took? And again, my question is, how have our views on that changed over, apart from questioning how we should feel about that? I'm interested in the more empirical question, just of how has thinking about that changed over the years? How has thinking changed about what we might call collateral deaths in warfare changed over the years? And then the very last thing I'll say, as I know I'm over my time, is because Norman brought it up, our evolving views about prevention. What are the circumstances under which we have felt we were allowed to intervene in violence that's happening elsewhere? And what are the circumstances in which we now believe we are compelled to intervene? And what kinds of actions is it permitted to take? Again, it's clear that those kinds of things have evolved dramatically over time. Our views on when and where and how we ought to intervene to protect others from violence, those have not stayed the same. And that's important because we know that this kind of violence, and fortunately almost all forms of organized political violence, have been declining in recent decades, at least, and maybe over a somewhat longer period of time. But genocides, and I work on quantifying genocides and these kinds of events there, the number of victims of genocide, almost any way you want to slice and dice that number, has been declining dramatically in recent decades. Still far too common, but far less than it was certainly in the first half of the 20th century. And we need to understand whether, and again, I think the big sweep of history might help us with this. Is this a blip in the broader sweep of human history? And that decades in the future, we'll look back on this as just a momentary pause in the long history of human inhumanity to other humans? Or is there something that has changed more fundamentally and that we can count on to preserve and continue this trend away from this particular form of violence. So I'll end there. But again, with thanks to Ben and all the people who worked on this volume for what I think is a really remarkable piece of or collection of scholarship.
Thank you so much, Professor Valentino. So who would like to answer this?
I would just like to say there's a lot of questions that Ben Valentino has just raised, and I think they're all terrifically helpful. I think he's pinpointed a large number of them that are worth thinking about, and I just want to say that I appreciate that those comments. I think it's worth just raising a few examples of how things have changed over attitudes have changed. For instance, the word extermination didn't mean what we now consider it to mean. Originally, it was driving people beyond the boundaries of something. It was a term for expulsion, really. And slowly over the centuries, it came to mean something quite different, equivalent to genocide, but focusing on different groups and with a lower level of intent. But that's a good example of how times have changed or attitudes have changed. And another example, I think, is the words that were used for genocide before its invention by Raphael Lemkin during World War II. Extermination came to fill that gap of a lack of a term for genocide, although in legal terms it didn't mean exactly the same thing, but it was often used to describe cases of genocide, or annihilation was another. And even in the case of Ireland in the 16th century, unpeopling was the term that came up. And so there was a concept of what we would call genocide that kept appearing in historical circumstances as if a word needed to be found for what we call genocide, but there wasn't one at that time, but words were coined, if you like. So I think that the discussion that Ben Valentino has raised is a very helpful one. I would just like to make a few short comments on three different terms that we haven't heard much of in the discussion so far. Ben mentioned intent, but we haven't heard much about motive, which is a very different legal term. And is motive an important component of genocide? Does it matter what the motives are, whether it's racial hatred or economic confiscation? What are the various possible motives? Land theft that cause groups to commit genocide, and under the legal definition, motive is irrelevant, but it's the intent, the deliberateness of the action rather than the motive behind it that's important. But it's worth thinking about the difference between motive and intent, and whether we think that racial hatred is the key motive that's required for genocide or not. Another term that we haven't heard much of in this discussion is ethnic cleansing, which we deliberately didn't include in the discussion in these three volumes. We included genocide and extermination. Ethnic cleansing, like the original meaning of extermination, implies, as the late and sadly missed scholar Helen Fine once pointed out, was ethnic cleansing implies driving out or expulsion, but it also implies some form of a refuge, whether inside the country or beyond the boundary. It doesn't, according to current understandings, the term ethnic cleansing doesn't necessarily imply genocide, although it's often used in popular sense to have the same meaning. But I think Helen Fine was quite right about that, and we didn't include cases of ethnic cleansing in these three volumes. And finally, causes of genocide. And I think it's important to distinguish between long-term causes of genocide, which might be political upheaval, famine, war, which allow perpetrators of genocide to manipulate public opinion, cultivate a following, raise an army, and then commit a genocide. Those are long-term causes of genocide, but the short-term or immediate or proximate causes of genocide are the decisions made by those individuals who then order their followers to commit a genocide. I think it's important to distinguish between those people who order the genocide and the long-term circumstances that they take the opportunity from, that they seize the opportunity to raise a following and commit genocide. I think we haven't discussed enough about the causes and the different kinds of genocide. But I'd like to hear more from others about those three issues. But thanks very much to all three of our commentators, Robin Melson, Hannibal Travis, and Ben Valentino, for their very insightful comments and remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, professors. So we would like now limit to 2 questions, and that would be from audiences, and then we can slowly, we are almost at the end of the session. So let's see if anyone has any question.
Can I say one thing?
Yes, sure, Professor.
I just wanted to comment briefly on Ben's questions.
Yeah, sure, definitely.
And I won't address them all either. But first of all, you've got your next project, Ben. You can write an intellectual history of this problem, and it will start from the very beginning in some ways. But just one of the things I wanted to mention, and this is that struck me in working on kind of a world history of genocide, is how many voices and how far back people understood that something really bad was going on. In other words, even the concept, of harem in the Old Testament, when the rabbis in the 6th century or whenever, BCE were writing the Bible, I mean, they understood that something really bad, was going on when God was ordering, this massacre or elimination, of peoples, in Canaan. And so, there's this understanding is one of the things that struck me. So it's not, somebody like De las Casas, right, who writes about the conquistadors, in South America, really, went after these guys. This was awful what they were doing, right? And it was like somebody writing today about, what the Russians again are doing in Ukraine, at Bucha. So there's this kind of, there is an understanding. You read the monks about the Crusaders, many of them say, well, fine, good, then they're just describing, but many of them have more than implicit, sense of injustice that is involved in these massacres and these sieges and so on and so forth. I mean, the other thing to think about too is somebody like Lemkin himself.
Wouldn't you agree there's been a change in the sense that back then those voices were the exception?
Yes, no, that's true.
And it was fully permitted to proclaim and the glory of the extermination that you committed. And now it's been flipped, where the exception would be anyone who could glorify. Even Hitler felt he had to keep quiet what he was doing because he knew how others would feel about it, right?
It depended on what others, right?
Yes, right.
And some others approved and some others didn't approve. Yeah. But, I'm not sure there's a kind of voice of mankind, that you can kind of, trace forward. I mean, even if you take something, I watch 3-4 times a week Russian television at night, and they're in a completely different world about what's going on. So all I'm trying to say is that there's a kind of balance. And if you take someone like Lemkin in the 20s, who's sort of this figure, he's not completely isolated. I mean, at the Lviv University, there's a circle of these people who are sitting around and saying, oh my God, look what happens in the world. Look what happened to the Armenians. Look what happened at the Simila massacre. And so there's a gathering. There are always people who are going to say, no, something's wrong here. That's all I was trying to say about that. And I think your instinct, by the way, the only other thing I would say, I don't want to add too much here, but the only I think your instinct is right about this group question. Why do we separate out groups? I mean, Ron will remember we had a conversation about this. I think it was at Berkeley, maybe 15, 20 years ago. God knows how long ago it was. And I remember this conversation. Somehow it was really, really stuck out at me, or stuck in my mind, where I think it was Jim Sheehan who was saying, well, there's just something really special in this world, about all of the diversity, right? I mean, it's sort of like the biodiversity that we care about now, having different animals and different species and that sort of thing. I think there's something there to what you're saying, that these groups are special, and that, I mean, it probably, you could do an intellectual history, maybe even starting with Herder or something in the beginning of the 19th century, who said all these little peoples, are really cool, and they all deserve their place under the sun, and they deserve their languages and their cultures, so there's something to that. I mean, I think your insight there is very good, but I would encourage you to write a book, another one. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, we would limit to 2 questions, and we have a hand from Professor Ronald Suni. So yes, you can ask your question, and then I would ask maybe one question. Yeah. Yes.
So thank you all. That was really a wonderful discussion and very informative. I want to follow up a little bit with what Ben said, because I think that he's raising really important questions. That you put together 3 volumes on genocide, but you managed to leave out ethnic cleansing. I can see why you would do that. It's a different category, and Norman made that distinction between mass killing of a genocidal quality and ethnic cleansing in his earlier book on ethnic cleansing. But now we have a problem in that the very concept of genocide is being questioned. I'm thinking here of Dirk Moses's recent intervention with his idea of permanent security. And I guess, to be provocative, I'm going to ask the 2 main speakers, Ben and Norman, to comment on that. Because as much as that concept of genocide might be controversial, you ain't going to get rid of it. It is the crime of crime in the popular understanding, and it's going to exist. But is there a potency and something very serious about the way Dirk presents that problem? I'd like you to inform me on that.
Just briefly, I think Dirk considers that genocide has been overestimated as the crime of crimes, and that there are plenty of other crimes which are as bad or nearly as bad. I can certainly see that, for instance, extermination as a crime against humanity is not given the importance that it should have. For instance, in the case of East Timor and the Indonesians' invasion of East Timor, the UN-sponsored Truth Commission concluded not that it was a case of genocide, but it was a case of extermination as a crime against humanity. And so I take that allegation, which I think is well documented in the Truth Commission report, as quite a serious crime. I'm not in the camp that says genocide is the only major crime, or the most heinous crime by far, the most heinous crime by far. I do think that extermination, as it is, I think, popularly considered, is, almost as heinous as genocide. I think genocide is slightly more heinous, or just more heinous, because it involves the destruction of people because they belong to a group for which they've had no choice in belonging, like an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group. Whereas extermination can apply to groups from which people can exit if they want. So it's perhaps slightly less heinous to kill off political groups in mass murder than it is to kill off ethnic groups. But it's still extremely heinous to conduct a campaign of extermination. So I don't agree with Dirk that people regard extermination as a much lesser crime, and that genocide has been somehow unfairly, but highlighted. I don't think that's a problem. I do think that genocide is an extremely heinous crime, but there are others that are very heinous as well. And I don't think we need to do away with the term genocide just for the reason that he asserts. War crimes, of course, they don't get enough attention. I think he cites some cases of war crimes that don't get enough attention. But I think when he cites collateral damage in war as pretty much on the same level as genocide, I don't agree with that. Certainly the fix for that, if you want to fix the ease with which war crimes, including collateral damage, are conducted and committed, is to tighten the laws of war crimes and to make them much more punishable, rather than to downgrade the concept of genocide. That's my quick response.
So, well, we've talked about Moses's book before. There's a lot in it, and it's filled with all kinds of interesting and different kinds of observations about the history and the analysis of genocide. I mean, I'm not really fond of the way he deals with Lemkin and anti-Zionism and Zionism and that kind of thing. But the idea of permanent security, I have no problem with as a part of the genocide mentality and as a part of genocide process, in some cases more than others. So I emphasizing that, I think, is perfectly legitimate. And dealing with that particular angle of genocide strikes me as making some sense. I mean, in your book, you have something, not exactly the same, but analogous when you talk about the Armenian genocide and the kind of threat that is to the Armenians to the threat that is perceived by the Young Turks at the time of the genocide. So that doesn't bother me. I fully agree with Ben that I don't, and with you too, that I don't see it substituting for the word or the concept of genocide, and the usefulness of it. I mean, it's done pretty well, especially since the Second World War. It took a couple of decades to sink in a little bit, but it's become a very useful term. I think, as I argued in that book a long time ago, it was 2001 now that it was published, Fires of Hatred, that ethnic cleansing is something different, that there are overlaps between ethnic cleansing and genocide, but that genocide is something different, and ethnic cleansing is described, I think, as a crime against humanity. In that branch, if you would do 3 volumes on crimes against humanity, you could do that, right? And you would order different, you would have maybe some of the same cases, but you would have different groups of cases, basically, in talking about crimes against humanity. I mean, you talk about the Holocaust again, too, because that was deemed a crime against humanity in Nuremberg. Yeah, I think that's basically what I would say. I mean, I think it's useful what Dirk tried to do there with that concept, but it just doesn't, every time a new term comes up, it doesn't work very well. And then it's for us. I mean, how many are we here? We're nine scholars. We're talking about it, but millions of people are talking about genocide, tens of millions of people. Everybody understands what it is. And that's why, like, again, to go back to my original comments about the book as a whole and Ben's leadership of it, it fits, it worked. And this goes to Ben Valentino's comment too. We sort of know what genocide is, and there are borders and there are places where extermination may be a better way to describe it, or other things may be other kinds of terms are a better way to describe it. But we have this common kind of body of understanding and knowledge that I think makes sense as long as we're not too rigid about it. I, for example, let me just express a little bit of difference with Ben. I'm beginning to think that I don't want to make a hierarchical decision between crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. The crime of crime. I frankly have changed a little bit on this. I used to really think of it, genocide, as crime of crimes, and I'm starting to think differently about that issue now. Mostly because I want to get away from these arguments, these kinds of arguments about, is it genocide, is it not genocide? And the importance of it is precisely because some people think, and many people think, it is the crime of crimes. And if terrible things are going on in Ukraine, it doesn't have to be genocide now, right? But because it's considered the crime of crimes, Ukrainians want it to be genocide. And so it's that does, and Dirk is right to identify that problem, which we all understand. That's why I'm just started thinking, well, I don't want to deal with this and try to make a hierarchy of these awful crimes, that occur. And what happened to Bucha, for example, is just an awful set of crimes in the other towns in occupied Ukraine.
Thank you, Professor. So this is the last question which I would like to ask, and this is related to the individual cherishment. This question is basically was suggested to me by our senior editor of CGC, Somali Chaudhary. So we spoke about the groups and also the ideologies. So do you think is an individual level analysis of the leaders necessary for an understanding of genocides? So this question I would like both Professor Kiernan and Neymark, if you could highlight something on this. Yeah.
I think my answer to that question is yes, largely because of the importance I give to the causes of genocide. The immediate causes of genocide. The immediate causes of genocide are the decisions made by the leaders of groups who order genocides to be carried out. And so their ideologies, the ideologies of the groups that they have come to lead are very important. The thinking behind their orders is very important. Of course, there are longer-term causes of genocide, as I mentioned earlier, which are more social and economic than political and psychological. But there's no reason why those causes would necessarily lead to genocide. But the decision-making of these leaders of movements who order genocides to take place, if they have the power to do so, are going to lead to genocides taking place. And that is very important. And to prevent genocide, we need to see these people and their ideologies before they come to power and are in a position to perpetrate genocide. We need to track those kinds of ideologies. We need to learn what kinds of thinking lead people to order genocides to take place. And that can be done in advance of the decisions that they make. The decision arises out of the ideological thinking, and that thinking can be recognized and identified in advance of their coming to power and making those decisions and issuing those orders. So this is very important in genocide prevention, to understand the ideologies and the thinking of genocidal leaders.
Yes, Professor Neymark, to you, if you have to suggest, and if you could say something on in regards to the current crisis in Ukraine. So yes, yeah, and the individual level analysis of personalities.
Well, I mean, I think this actually fits with Ben's very good answer about the role of ideology and how that works, because we have a really murderous ideology that has emerged. I mean, I would say has emerged during the course of the war. I mean, we talked about this before. I mean, genocide is a process, right? It's a process that happens, and it's true. Many of these murders and killing and transfer of children took place in earlier phases of the war, although still going on in Ukraine. The ideological material that is coming out of Russia right now is extremely frightening. I mean, we have people advocating, on Russian, again, I'm watching a lot of Russian media just to try to keep in touch with what they're saying to each other, about the war. And there are specifically eliminatory language being used by many people in the official media. I mean, I heard something the other night. I'm just going to tell you this. He's way out there. This guy Vladimir Solovyov, and he's not a regular comment. I mean, he's a regular commentator, but he's not a typical for what's coming in the Russian media. But he was interviewing some general. Now you have to understand there are 10 zillion generals in Russia. I mean, I think every third person in the army is a general, or and this was like 3 nights ago, and the guy was saying essentially we're going to have to eliminate some of the Ukrainians. I mean, he said it on a broadcast in Moscow Radio 1, and that kind of thing is quite common now for what's going on in Russia. And then we have Vladimir Putin's view of history, right? I mean, that was formally presented. That view of history, denies the Ukrainians the right to their nationhood, to their sovereignty as a nation, to their ability to determine their own future. And in doing so, has some features that could be interpreted, as genocide. You're not the nation you think you are. And we're going to show you that you're not the nation you think you are. And if you disagree with us, we're going to make sure you go somewhere else. Meaning, in some cases, I mean, he doesn't advocate killing the way this general did. I mean, I was shocked by this thing a few nights ago. But that historical, the building of a historical narrative about what Ukraine is and what it should be in the future is really terrifying. So to Ben's point, we're at a stage here where, again, I'm hesitant to use the word genocide in Ukraine. People use it. I think that's maybe premature, and that kind of evidence doesn't exist. But the warning signs are there. The warning signs are there. The what if Russia wins the war warning signs are there for potential for potential genocide. So the situation in Ukraine, I consider dire. I mean, right now that's a kind of, beating the hell out of each other in a stalemate of sorts, kind of war. But the war has got to end. It's just got to end. I mean, and we all know. I mean, we're all students of genocide, so we all know that war breeds genocide. I mean, that's the only way to look at war. And the war, if for no other reason, the threat of genocide is an indicator that the war has to end. It just has to end.
Thank you so much, Professor Neymar. And so we are at the end of this event and session. So it was a wonderful discussion today we have, and extensive knowledge which we shared on the world history of genocide. As I mentioned, this volume is indeed the first and leading documented history of world genocides. And thanks to Professor Kiernan and Professor Neymar for presenting this to the world. And as you know, as I mentioned, both of you have been always my inspirations. And after reading these volumes, I think that both of you should work more on this, documenting world history of genocides together. And yeah, with these sort of projects are really required when we are in the midst of a war and we are seeing day by day war crimes and these situations. So it's really required. And it was a great discussion indeed with the panelists. I would like to thank each of them, Professor Melson, Professor Travis, and Professor Valentino, and all the other scholars who had joined us today and posed their questions. It was a great evening which I had, and I wish all the best to your upcoming projects, to all of your upcoming projects. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to everyone.